this video basically is going to start back in 1967. The reason being, this was the first time I had ever built what I guess has come to be accepted in the stunt world as a flat tail. It was carved out of a solid sheet of half-inch balsa, and in the middle cut out, very similar to a Nobler, of course. And it was one of the things, you see the extreme taper where it's bigger at the root than at the tip? That was one of the things I thought in my great engineering days way back then, and in my good choice of hats, by the way. One of the things I thought would be somewhat of an advantage because it would have added to the model something I call arrow stability. Every time the leading edge presents itself to a different angle, it would tend to self-center, the same way the rake in the wing, the leading edge rake, is an advantage over having a straight wing.
And because this is going to be a dedicated tail video of how to make your own tail, and as we do it, we're going to evolve what will be the tail for the Typhoon. But the first thing we want to do is a little bit of the logic. First off, you're not born knowing a whole lot of this. Not many people I know are born knowing even how to fly good. You need to learn, and our learning curve goes way back. But one of the things we did learn years ago is by putting extra rake into the leading edge of the stab, and many of my ships going back have had what I call arrow stability. At least an attempt was made to get arrow stability. And what that means is as the plane tends to yaw, it exposes a much bigger area. It's kind of self-centering. The less the angle is, there's almost no self-centering at all. And of course, if this is flat, you can turn it this way, and there's no self-centering action at all. Where the idea is, as this goes into the wind, it presents a much bigger area on this side. This side tends to disappear, and so it self-centers. And I call that arrow stability. I've used that on an awful lot of my planes. It's worked well. It just turns out that we're going to try to use a good portion of it on a Typhoon as we lay out the Typhoon. A lot of the things we're going to try are going to be similar to Miss Ashley, but cosmetically we're going to change it because the Typhoon is larger. We will not be able to use constant section elevators, but what I'm suggesting is people are going to use this technology, this way of building a tail, to make a tail for their own plane. Whatever that design is, you can adapt. And of course, Mike Kajeski took this tail, just for one, and made cardinal tips, and that worked out very well. And you can see basically what we're going to do is give up some area here, add area here. In the case of the Typhoon, because what we're going to do is we're going to build a Miss Ashley type of tail and then just cosmetically change the tips so that we have an angle. And Elliot Scott has already drawn this out for us in full scale, so we have a pattern, a very accurate pattern. But basically the heart of this is going to be no different than a 1967 sweeper, or in our case a Miss Ashley, or a tweener, a 92 Cardinal. But what I'm suggesting you can do is by using the wrapped leading edge, the straight grain, all of this technology, you can put this to use in whatever design you're making. It's the technology that's going to be good. If you go back to the 1992 videos, you know this original prototype Cardinal, we made 3 of these that were for all purposes identical. And one of the only changes we made was the tail. Now, this didn't have the rake tail, the raked leading edge, and what happened was you have more span and less rake. And I thought the ones with the higher rake in the tail actually flew better. I was of the opinion that the rake in the tail was a significant good trim feature. And so it was pretty much from this point on that whenever I could, I added extra rake into that tail. Tail was one of the best ones. It was the lightest of all the tails. And it's one that we want to build on. See, each year we try to build on the technology that we've accumulated over the years. We don't want to keep hitting the reset button. We want to keep making each ship just a little bit better.
Over the years, as we've built cardinals, we've built them with bigger tails, thicker tails, thinner tails, airfoil tails, flat tails. So we have a good database to build on. But we've certainly done a lot of experimenting in terms of trying to come up with what we think is the best tail, and then using it, just make the cosmetic changes to fit the plane that we're building at the time. Now, one of the things, of course, and again, I've said this many times, is it affects the stability of the plane. You can make the tail volume bigger and smaller, and there's gains and losses at both ends of that. There's also gains and losses to making the tail higher above the wing. But like all things in stunt, it's the compromise that gives you the best of all worlds that we're shooting for. We're not shooting for, a single goal. We're shooting for a lot of goals at the same time. What we're looking for is the best compromise, and even during the Spitfire program, if you notice, we had moved the hinge line further forward and back. It gets better in some ways when you move it back. The plane gets more stable. As you move it forward, you get a more violent corner. But obviously what you're looking for always is that compromise between the height of the stab off the wing, the total volume of the tail, the thickness of the tail. All these things affect how the final trim of the airplane is going to be. I know Ted and David basically have done the same thing, moving the hinge line further forward, back. David wrote a great article for Stunt News on different airfoil shapes, flat shapes, but you try to put all the data together to come up with what I hope will be the best possible tail for the Typhoon, and that same information will be usable. You can improvise a way of turning it into your next plane. Now, tail design is just a super complex subject, and I'm only trying to hit the high points. But I really was happy with, when I look back at 7 or 8 planes that are built with that extra rake in the tail. Some of the people have nicknamed them the shovel tails, the snow shovel, the dustpan tails, but I always was happy with that. But it's certainly not the only way to accomplish the goal that we're looking for. Joe Adamusco did the original design on the Spitfire. He basically put the hinge line at 50% of the area, and it was a flat tail, again a half-inch flat tail, but it didn't have molded leading and trailing edges. It didn't have hollow pieces where the hinges were, and it tended to be a little on the heavy side relative to what we are able to make tails now. When we made the Seaflyer, we evolved into the next level. We moved the hinge line, got more stability, changed the area just a bit, and it was a good compromise. I think the Seaflyer was the best of the 3 Spitfires. But again, we made all the changes to the plan, so if we wanted to, for instance, build an exact copy of this, we'd be able to. And what we did the year after that is we wanted to try to make the tail thinner. Now, this was a radical departure, and there's a good trade-off. The trade-off with a thin tail is the plane gets very, very violent in corners. You can really make it corner hard. The downside is it gets a little more difficult to fly. So again, it's that compromise between having maybe a little bit more corner than you need, maybe, just having it really close to what you want, or that would suit almost every pilot. But again, you have to look back at what areas, and it's these areas and volumes relative. There's a percentage that we work off, and it's a top secret that only Joe Adamusco knows. I'm not even sure he knows. I'm not sure any of us know, but it's really a seat of the pants thing, and you can tell just about that was a little bit too much, a little bit not enough, and that's the way a lot of this stuff evolves. And this is the way, in my book, because so many Cardinals have been built with so many days, one with a straight tail, one with a shovel tail, you arrive at conclusions that are based in fact, not in just taking a wild guess and saying, well, let's see how that works. And I think you just have a more educated guess in the overall picture of things. So with that in mind, and we could go on and on forever with the discussion of tail technology, but I think it's just more appropriate, it would be more helpful if we just go build what we think is going to be our best tail,
We improvise. Each year we add a few new touches, and this year we have a few that we've never done before. This is going to be the first time we do these. We're going to make a laminated leading edge, and we're going to see how that works. As this evolves, we've already made carbon fiber wings, Nomex flaps. We're going to be doing some little testing now. We have some Nomex that we want to make some test parts out of. But for the purpose of this video, we're just going to concentrate on making a traditional, a tail that virtually everybody in the world would be able to replicate and customize to meet their own needs. And if you're building a Cardinal kit, I'm going to replace the video that normally would be going in a Cardinal kit to when a person wanted the video on building a tail. We're going to replace it with this video. This one is our latest video. This is a tail that Mike Kajeski has already built. He's already built this tail using the methods similar than we're going to show, except with the exception of the leading edge. It proved to be a really, really nice, light tail, very easy to make. And if you're making a Cardinal kit, again, this is what I would suggest you do. Take all these shapes and areas off of the Miss Ashley plans for now, and just improvise your own little wingtips. Everything else here tends to build very quickly. These tails go together in a matter of hours, not days and weeks. They tend to be extremely light and extremely straight because they're built on a flat surface. Thing that I'm going to do is take a nice piece of 32nd, and this is the part that we're going to do just a little bit differently than we've done in the past. A lot of it will be close to being the same, but again, each year we want to evolve it into a little bit better system, a little bit better method. This is 32nd inch wood, and what I'm going to do is wet this down with some ammonia, and then I'm going to use this little mold, and all this mold is an ordinary dowel. You can use a dowel, you can use a rod, as long as it's 3/8 of an inch. I've taped it to a piece of 3/8 balls, and it doesn't have to be, you're not even going to see the tape marks through it. You could be real fancy and fill this in with Bondo, air epoxy light if you want, but this mold has made plenty of good pieces. So the first thing I want to do, take these over and get them soaked with ammonia. Ways of wetting it, you can wet it with ordinary house water, but when it's wood this thin, I like to use the ammonia. And you want to try not to breathe a whole lot of this in. Ammonia is not really a great item to be breathing in. You'll get a headache or whatever. But the idea of using two pieces here is to make a stronger and a lighter leading edge. And we're going to be thinning out aliphatic resin. We're going to be cutting a new piece of wood. Anyway, not long enough. I have plenty of wood, so it'll just be a question of, let's make sure we have a piece that has decent grain in it. It just shows you when you're not careful. You reach over to the pile, get another piece. Now this might not be a place that you want to use if you're using a tail release stooge. The leading edge does take a little bit of a beating. So you'll want to use a piece that's relatively straight. And here's one piece. As soon as you hit it with ammonia, it springs. But all the little jobs we've been doing, making molds, we've been making them out of laminates. Now another thing I'm going to try to make in the future, next time I get an order for a turtle deck, notice how the wood springs from the moisture. I'm going to try to mold the leading edge out of the turtle deck out of several pieces of 32nd. I have a good supply of 32nd now. That aliphatic and the grain being in a little bit different makes for a nice piece. Now I usually let this soak a couple of minutes, 2 or 3 minutes. Dry off as much of the ammonia as I can with some dry paper towels. Then I'm going to mix up the aliphatic resin. It's Elmer's aliphatic resin, but I don't think it really matters. The resins all seem to be very similar. But I don't want to have, I'm going to clear the table, because I'm going to try to get as thin a coat of glue on this as I can. Up an aliphatic resin part, because the wood is so thin, Some of the glue might tend to bleed down into your mold. You can wrap the mold with either wax paper, in this case I have some sheets of Teflon. Anything that'll keep the glue, if it does seep through, to stick on it. And I just tape that right in place. Little tips. I've had several different brands of this alphatic, some sandable, some not sandable. Weldwood, Typhoon, there's about 10 different brands. Some of the brands, and I don't know why, really don't like ammonia at all. Some of them do. So it's always good to do a little test. Now if you find out the glue you're attempting to use is not happy with ammonia, and you could do that little test, just make a little puddle of ammonia, pour some glue in it, see if it turns to jello. Then the next thing you can do, either buy another type of glue, or you can take, in the case of, anytime you get some, if you don't have the best possible wood in the world and you want to make molds, a good way is heat some boiling water and pour boiling water on it. Just be careful you don't burn yourself like I've done many times. Now, I smear the glue out by hand. I don't want to miss a spot. I'm not trying to be cute. I want to push it right into the wood grain. I've gotten off as much of the water as I can. I like to take some of the glue off here. That little thing of protecting the mold, we've had a few stick until we came up with that little idea. I can put both of these together now, center them on the mold. And right now you can see, because the wood is wet, it's really nice and flexible. You can almost bend it right around without it even cracking. So what I do is I kind of start hand forming it, because you're really bending the glue joint now. You really have to work, you don't want to take all day to do this. And this is the only step we can actually do today, because this has to dry up by a heating vent pretty much overnight. I guess you could force dry it with a hairdryer. I found to wrap this is little by little. As I make a wrap, I'm kind of pushing it down because it is delicate at this point, but once that glue dries, see what you're doing, the way you're building strength here is you're combining two different grains. They're just a little bit different, and when they're laminated together they become almost like a balsa type of plywood. Very, very strong relative to the weight. I kind of press it down as I go along. Idea that always makes sense. If you know you're going to make a tail, about a week before, make a piece like this every day for a week. And then you can have 4 or 5 of these pieces. You can weigh them after they're laminated. See which is the straightest, the truest. Because the day you do this, you're done for the day, pretty much. In our case, we're going to cut out some parts and get some other stuff done. But it's a good idea to have a few of these made ahead of time. The last step here is to press down, and I'm going to give this about 5 minutes of just squeeze, because what I'm doing is I'm squeezing out all the extra glue and making sure I have a good bond on everything. And I'll put this up by the heating vent to dry overnight. Tomorrow when I come down, I will have a leading edge. And if my work schedule doesn't turn out that I'm going to work on this tomorrow, I'll make an extra leading edge. But it's always good to leave it 24 hours, I guess. I never tried to, put it in a microwave or something to cure it. But pretty much, when that comes out, that'll have the leading edge shaped. And the deal is, I'm hoping that this molded part is going to be stronger and lighter. We're always trying to make a part either stronger or lighter, or stronger and lighter. Those are the objectives. We get all the bandages off. Of course, what we're trying to do is make a kit so that when we get a dedicated day, we can work on this. We'll pull our piece off, and because we have the Teflon, this is no glue at all. This one came right off, in fact. And it's laminated, you can see, from 2 pieces. It's got the curve built right in. It's as straight as an arrow. Wow, this is really a good one. Okay, now this will be our leading edge for the Typhoon tail. The next step is I want to make up some of the ribs, the tentative ribs. So what I'm doing today is I have a little bit of time before I have to go down to my rental property. I've got about an hour, so I can make up all the ribs. So that when a day comes that I'm going to do the tail, I can just, it's like making a kit. It's kind of time management. I have all the parts cut out. All these parts will be on the Typhoon plans for the people that are interested, so you can just cut them out and trace them. And the day you're going to make the tail, you can just assemble it. Now what I do, I cut out each one individually, of course, and have a little template made out of 16th plywood. It's the same template Mike's used and we've used on several other projects. Then what I do, and it's a nice little trick, and you can use it on both type of ribs, you can stack them all down. Now if you were going to sand this is real difficult to hold it. And if you put it down on a flat area, a piece of glass, and sand it, it's a little bit better. But there's an even better way to do it, and this is really one of the good tricks. You have all the ribs rough cut, and there's always one that's a little higher or lower or whatever. The thing that's hard to do is to get it that you can hold it like in a vise. But what I do is I stack them, because I want the leading edge as straight as possible. Now you know while I'm doing this on camera I'm going to drop these. But what this allows me to do now is any inaccuracies in the leading edge, in fact I can't even get these even right now, they're on an angle. This is really such a nice trick though. You can kind of dress them off. Now this is that 80 grit sandpaper that's sticky back glued to the table. What this allows me to do, I can get them really even now. Now if you really want it to be fanatical, and I don't think it's real necessary, you could make 2 plywood templates and sand into the templates would be another way. But this way we can kind of mass produce ribs, and if I'm real careful about turning it over, this will ensure that every one of them is very similar. We won't have any waves. And you see a nice flat sheeted tail. See that this tail design depends on the sheeting going tip to tip without a center joint. It's where you lose on a foam tail as it concentrates the stress on the center. Anything that there's a joint in the center, it's a problem. This eliminates one of those problems. Now I'll do the same thing with the elevator ribs. And we'll be ready when we get a day to lay this up, and probably tomorrow we'll get a chance to lay this right up. We'll be able to put the whole tail together probably in 1 or 2 days. Things with this, let me show this. As I try to get all these ribs even on one side anyway, before I start the sanding operation. Then I can trim this down. Now remember, the one scenario you don't want to have is that the elevators are thicker than the stab. If it's thinner or the same, it's much, much better. Now, I want to make sure that when I put these up against, since everything's going to be sheeted with the same sheet, I want to make sure the back of the ribs and the front of the stab can be thicker or the same, but I don't want the stab to be thinner and have the elevators thicker than the stab. That's a nice way to true everything up, by the way. Trick is that sandpaper glued to the table. I do a lot of final sanding on these ribs because there's going to be a taper in the elevators. But the first thing I want to do, I will get them as rough as possible. I want to make sure that you see that I'm a little bit thicker on a stab. Not so much, because as I shorten these ribs, I need at least 1 inch where the taper is going to be able to absorb that little bit right there. So with that in mind, I guess we can put the ribs away. That's what I'm kind of looking for right now. Before I assemble anything, I always like to scrape the table because we've been working with CA composites, and we don't need that big a piece of the table, but we do want, oops, there's a piece right there. We do want to start with a relatively flat piece of the table. It's a shame when you build something and right in the middle of it there's a little dot of CA or something that chews the part up on you. The first step I want to work on, I can mark my leading edge. This, of course, is ready to start working with. I'm going to need a piece with an angle in it. And it looks like I'll have plenty left over. This thing, of course, I want to trim where the parts are not lined up exactly right. So let me take a couple of swipes and then I'll go over to the sanding strip. That sandpaper that we have glued to the table has one of our most valuable tools. Because what I want to do is get a true edge on this. I want to get a perfectly straight edge. Now imagine if you're carving this piece from a solid piece, how difficult it would be to get that perfectly straight like that. Of course, it's good if you can hold it perfectly flat. Another thought I had was to try to do it this way. And that kind of roughs it out, but now the final little bit I can take with my long sanding block. And this will make for getting a nice joint on this. And the next step will be to cut the pieces and fit the angles and just get it tacked together. Always like to get the dust away from the building area. I want to carefully line up this center because I have this width. I've taken it right from the mold. I don't want this to come to a point because it's a take-apart airplane. I want to have the piece that's going to butt up against the bulkhead nice and flat. What I can do here is just follow this right through. Okay, now what I did, I laid out the joint, beveled the edges, and this is ready to just tack glue together. And what I do is I use my angles right off the plan to make sure I'm following the plan. I want to use as little of the leading edge as possible because the grain is going in the wrong direction. Grain that's going here isn't doing me a lot of good. What I want, and it's the way we build strength without weight, is by getting one piece to go tip to tip with the grain straight. When the grain goes up and back like a foam tail, you're losing about 30% of the strength. It's handy to use a little piece of tape if you need to when joining the parts. What I do is I just tack them together, then I take the tape off, take them over, and turn them upside down. Because if you've built a bow into it, when you turn it upside down, it'll be double the amount. And once I know that this is perfectly straight, if it isn't, I can dress off the high side or the low side. Then I'll make a permanent glue seam on the inside. But the first thing is to get that I have it made like a little little rattlesnake here or something. Now next thing I want to do is trim the edges. Just lay it over the plans, trim the edges. I have this glue inside and outside and just dressed off with sandpaper, and I know it's flat. I've laid it on the table this way and this way. So I know I have at least what amounts to be a straight leading edge now. You know, there's many ways to do this. Each time I do it, I try to improvise a little bit or try to make what I call upgrades so that ultimately at the end of it, at the end of whatever amount of time I've spent, I have what I hope is the best possible way to pass on. And each year we try to make it a little bit better. Now once this is done, and I'm satisfied that it's nice and straight, I'm going to get out my sheeting for the center. Remember, the way this builds strength without weight is by having one sheet tip to tip. That's where the gain is in this. I use a tail-mounted stooge that basically launches the model from the leading edge of the tail. What I always try to do is on the inside, before I go any further, just run a little bit of CA in there, just to stiffen up, harden up the wood. it's really just a cheap insurance policy, because once you have a dent in there, fixing it up, where you wind up fixing it is the spot where it's going to rub on a stooge. And this actually has no hint of a dent in there, so I guess this is working well. Okay, so we have our leading edge piece. It's all joined, it's straight. The next thing we're going to do is lay out the piece of sheeting here. For this step, the most important thing is to have good sea grain. I want to make sure. Now, I have to make this little piece up here, so I'm just going to rough it out. Let me line this up. Now, I took not the lightest piece of sea grain, but the straightest. If you use a piece of sea grain that's got or a piece of wood, it's going to wind up being a bowed tail. Now, we really looked hard for these. I've really been trying to get 3 or 4 real nice pieces to make the tail up. Transpose this angle onto a piece of quarter grain. Again, I'm going to actually use the sheet itself as my template. So the first thing I want to do, I've taped it in place. A couple little pieces of tape. Now I can follow this line, pick up this line, and I have a real good idea of exactly what that angle will be. And of course the same thing on the other side. That sets me up for that angle. I'll do the same thing on this side, then all I have to do is figure out what this little piece in the middle is going to be, and I'll have one sheet. Now what I can do here is just put a little piece of tape on here. In fact, I don't even need to use the end of the piece. I'll have a bigger piece left over. Now I can carry this angle right up here, and then I'll just have to remove the flat. And once I cut this piece off, then I'll just run up a little tack glue seam here. Okay, now that glue seam is on her, I can just trim this off. And then the next step would be, I need to figure out where the flat is. I can work right off of this piece, and that'll give me the flat. Now, if you're going to make a joint, it's always a good idea to get both joints flat. It just makes for a nicer joint. Also, to leave the dust on. The little dust that stays on helps kick off the CA nice and slow without turning it into popcorn. Now, sometimes in the past when I've done these, I've joined these sheets and then try to lay the ribs on. What I wanted to do, though, is as just a way of maybe making it a little easier, is I have the rib taped in place. Just get my T-square out and trace in the ribs right while it's in this position. Because once I join that piece on, it'll be real difficult to get these angles at 90 degrees. And even though it isn't really critical, we also want to get an accurate center line on there. I'm just trying, even little ways like this, that each step, if you can save 10 minutes here, 10 minutes here, an hour here, in the overall picture, it's just that much easier. This is one little upgrade I think is going to save a little bit of time over the way we did it in the past, but getting the lines on nice and straight before we attach the leading edge. Even if you can save 5 minutes here and 5 minutes there, see what happens as you get older and older. It's like having less and less money to spend, you have less and less time to spend. One way to get a nice joint here. Notice I took this extra piece of paper out from under the plans. I'm trying to put a little pressure on this. And what I'll do, I'll tack it in between the And once you get to this point, it's already starting to be a tail. I mean, this is the nice part about doing this. If you prefab up the parts, an hour into it, you have something that looks like a tail. You can just get just one little dot. And while that tape is pulling it together, I get a nice tight seam. Once you take this off, needless to say, here, you just get a blade. The tape can come off now, but you can see even before you take the tape off how nice that seam worked out. And because it's done on a flat table, you hope, you know, you can always build a twist into it, but you have a pretty good chance of having that right. As soon as I'm just going to run that glue seam, we'll be ready to lay ribs in here. We're really moving right along on this. One thing I like about this is how everything has a flat surface that you work with. You're not building it in midair or on foam blocks or something. Because I can hold this up and I have it tacked, I can run that seam without gluing it down to the table. Because this is the inside, I'm not worried if it's smooth. Let that kick off, and then I'm going to just dress this side off. This side will already be done. For on this side is if there's any little rough spots, because I wouldn't want it to make a little mountain in the joint. You can see really, even with a minimum of sanding, how nice the joints come out using that method. Step on this, and this actually goes quicker than you think. Let's take one rib at a time, line them right up on the line. Now because they're tremendously oversized, we'll just trim them all off where we have to. I'm just lining them right up. The edge holds it in place. You can almost look and see that they're all 90 degrees. It's not a, if it's 89.7, it won't be the end of the world, believe me. But because we're working on flat glass, and we've got sea grain, and it's taped, it's the taping it in place that seems to help. I mean, this is the way all of the models I wish would go together. Anyway, one of the things I thought of, because this is really one of the ways we're going to be upgrading the Cardinal kit soon, of coming up with a little tail kit, just a kit for making the equivalent of everything but the tips. We're in the middle of getting the ribs laser cut. I guess it wouldn't be that big of a deal to get a bunch of these ribs cut also. Anyway, you can pretty much figure how that's going to work out. Now when I tack them in, I'm going to hold each one down, of course, one by one. I just want to see that it's perfectly flat before I do anything. Nice about this is holding it, kind of jigging it in place, and I'll tack each one of the ribs. Yeah, kind of nice. I'm sure we're not going to change tail designs real quickly, and having them laser cut, boy, this would be a piece of cake. Now again, the trick is tack everything. Don't permanently glue anything. And once you see that it's straight, it's always the best way to do it in my estimation. You always allow yourself the most choices. Now, of course, I have to put the end ribs on. Okay, once that kicks, I'll hold this till it kicks. That should be relatively straight. Holding it real nice here, and I can just run a little more than a tack since we know we have it nice and straight now. If you make a structure at every step of the way, you check it, against a flat surface, the odds are good in the end it's going to be relatively flat. The thing you get in trouble is when you try to build parts in midair or on things that are not flat. In fact, here's one that isn't sticking down. See that, Wendy? You must check every one. But once we have these glued in, then we'll just carefully run a sanding block across the top to see if there's another loose one. Even at just that little tack isn't quite enough. As I'm holding the back down, I've had the front down. Just running a little bit up on the leading edge here. When I think of carving even a cardinal kit, the way the kit is built with all those big sticks and everything, and what the chances are of getting that airfoil perfect on both sides. Step is to trim off with a brand new blade. Just trim all the ribs off just to get them out of our way. This little step here is going to be to put in the rib that's on the end. Have them all trimmed off. Every time I go through this, I'm amazed how quickly it gets to this point. It's a tail. It's like a comb. What is it, a rake, a comb, or a tail? I'm using the same method I used on the other side. I'm going to make up this sheet out of a good piece of quarter grain. The main thing is that it's a nice straight piece. Little things as I'm trimming this in and trying to get it to lay exactly how I want. Before I actually put some glue on this, what I want to do is I just want to do these little pieces of tape to hold it shut. And I want to put some weights on it to make sure it's perfectly flat. See that I'm not building in a twist of any kind. All this stuff sounds like overkill until you build a whole model and find out you have a warp in a tail and you can't get rid of it. I need another weight. And now I want to make sure it's as flat as can be and just tack this down. Now once that kicks, I want to check that it's perfectly flat before I run that glue seam. It is. Whoops, I made a little jig. So that I could let gravity run down and catch the glue on each one of the ribs. Otherwise, if I'm setting the glue in this way, I think this is a little bit of an upgrade anyway. A couple more pieces of tape on here. Because once these ribs take a set, by having this jigged in position on a relatively straight area, see, now I can go down one rib at a time. And if I can see any light, like I can here, I can just hold that down, hold this, and then work my way right down the whole wing. At this point, now I know I'm laying this on a flat piece of glass. Of course, it's got to be sanded, but it's basically flat in both dimensions. And because it's flat, if it were crooked or twisted, there'd be a certain amount you could maneuver it. When it's airfoiled, it's not only hard to check, it's harder to check. Anyway, now you can see what I've got is relatively straight. I need to trim the back end. And before I go any further, I want to get what will amount to be the trailing edge put in place. The reason is Hey, I'm trying to build a tail. Calm down. Oh my God, he gets me soaking wet. Unbelievable. I gotta put up with this at least twice a day. He takes a bath. Look at this. Hey! On Miss Ashley, this bird is shaking water all over me. On Miss Ashley, what we did is we used a large piece of 1/4 inch and then hollowed it out where there were no hinges. And what I thought is I'd try a little bit different scenario here. Is I'm going to make the trailing edge out of a piece of 1/16 sea grain, and I'm going to put little blocks where the hinges will go. So the first thing I need to do is lay this out over the plan and get some idea of what this trailing edge is going to look like. And I'll have to make a commitment to where the hinges will be, 3 on each side. The things we can do is put 1 in the tip, so we don't have to deal with that. Now I just want to evenly space the other 2. I want to make a reference point here. The horn acts as a hinge in there, so I can bring this out, and what I'll do is I'll try to get it right on top of a rib so that any piece of the horn would go out there. And a lot of this is just eyeball stuff. Now I can just lay this out so I know on the plan this is the hinge locations. This is going to go to Elliot so he can do the final plans. It'll show the hinge location, of course. Now I just transpose that over to the other side for way of checking, and I know these are not exactly the way I want them. Yeah, I missed this one here. And now I have my hinge pockets laid out. And I want them to be equal, of course. For the reasons we can get away with using a thin trailing edge like this, and it's one of the advantages. I'm just going to mark out where these hinge pockets go, because we're never going to fly this plane without the hinge lines taped. We've learned the hard way on take-apart planes. The control gap is usually a little more than average, and therefore it's good to always tape the hinge lines. Anyway, now I'm going to make up little blocks of wood. I want to scribe these on here because this is going to be the back piece, and I want to make up little blocks of scrap wood for this. We'll just set the hinge pockets on the center line now that we have this laid out. Again, if you save 2 grams here, 3 grams here, a gram here, what happens at the end of the plane, you've got a light plane instead of a heavy plane. And last year's tail was extremely light. One of the reasons that plane, I think, was so successful. If it did have a heavier tail, it's debatable whether it would have gotten better. Now, I know where the hinge, because I can picture them here. And now I want to put little blocks of wood, little triangle blocks of wood right where the hinge pockets are going to go. Strip off a piece. This is a real nice straight pieces, 1/4 inch. Not that this really matters, but I can lay out my little, what will be the little hinge pockets. I need 4 of them. Again, we've done this 2 different ways. It remains to be seen when we're done. We'll see first off which tail is the straightest, which tail was the easiest to build, which tail was the lightest. So we have a lot of very easy criteria to work from. Now, because the hinge will be coming right in on the center, I want to take a little bit of this material off on the corner. Don't have to get too fancy here. In fact, I can take a little more of this off. But every time you get rid of a gram here, a gram here, it's like when you're on a diet. A pizza pie here, a pizza pie there. All of a sudden you're in trouble. It works both ways. Now the other thing I can do here, I can put a little more of an angle on this. Now I'm going to run the hinge pockets because I have the slot on the other side. I can run the, well, we can call them hinge pockets for right now. We'll call them, what are we going to call them anyway? But I think that way is just a little bit easier to do than the way we did on Miss Ashley. I think, again, it's a little bit of an upgrade. Plus we know where that slot is now. We can just carefully use the hinge itself. And we'll be trimming the hinges anyway. We trim that exact amount off, so there's one way you can save a little weight, and it's really no extra work at all. The thing I need to do is, by holding this up here, I need to know which of the ribs need to be notched, because those little pieces are going to go into the back of the rib, and this will pretty much set them right in place. I've got the little indentation there. I can just Dremel that away. And this shows the little indentation. Just need to, you could cut the rib, or I guess it's easier just to cut this, then you don't lose any integrity of the rib. And what that'll do, and that locks in there. Laying it down, you can see exactly where each one is going to line up. Alignment trick is to lay this out so the same amount of line is on each side. We know the lines are drawn for the straight edge, and we know we have the same amount of gap on each side. I didn't want to try making it too small. And you don't want to cut that piece out and then try to glue it on. It's easier to glue it on when it's on a flat piece. And this is all nice C grain anyway. Now what I'm going to do first is, by pressing out, just tack it in 3 or 4 little spots, then side it, check it with a ruler. Then if I'm happy on both sides, I'll run the whole glue seam. But if I'm not happy, if I tack it and it has a bow or bend, or if I've done something crooked, I just want to be able to snip it, put it in position, and get that edge perfectly straight. Every step of the way I'm checking this for straightness. My personal secretary doing the email. Where do you go now? Come on, let's get back to this. Again, every time I put a tack on here, I want to make sure I have a perfectly straight edge. And also, while I do one side, as soon as I do one side, I'll check this with a 90-degree triangle to make sure I don't have it off one way or another. But since it's just tacked on, even if it's wrong, I can make an adjustment. I know I need to get, before I run the glue seam, it's a little bit off to that side. Tweaking this back and forth about 4 times. It looks like we finally got it. Again, one more little detail. Now that should ensure a relatively straight trailing edge. Next thing, of course, I'll just knife off everything and get over to the sander. That's about all I'm going to get to do tonight, but I can get that, a little bit of the sanding done and the shaping. And then last thing, check that every single part of it is flat and straight and true. What I've been trying to do even is do as much of the dressing off with a long straight block as I can. That's about all we're going to work on tonight. But again, in just a couple hours, we've made this, which is a major part of a plane. But the most important thing isn't that the time we've saved. The most important thing is that it is really rigid. The first time you build one of these, you'll be shocked at how rigid this is relative to any other way that I know of to do it. The The reason is you've got that C-grain wood running tip to tip, no joint, no dead wood hanging around, and no dead wood up here. It's just a well-engineered piece. And we know we have the hinge lines right on center without even setting up our tool. Today, the next step is I prepped up a horn exactly the way we did for the flap horn, soldered the bushing in with Stay Bright silver solder, made the two little keepers, making sure we have a little bit of clearance so we don't get a one drop of CA in there and fry up the whole thing. I put a little bit of chain lube in there and make sure there's no binding whatsoever. Looks like that one's not totally free yet. Oh, it's binding out on the end, that's why. Okay. Now we need to figure out exactly where and how we want to install this on the trailing edge. Because we have the very thin trailing edge, I want to make a little brace for the back of this. Now we decided we're not going to try to make a multiple set of bushings here. If I decide in the middle of trimming the plane that I need to have this adjustment, I'll drill the holes because it's a take-apart plane. I have that option. It'd be very easy and convenient to do it. Just one of the things I don't really think I'm going to need, because Miss Ashley and several of the other planes that use this force arrangement usually wound up right at 1-to-1. Usually what I'll do, because the stab is symmetrical on both sides, what I'll do before I even insert the one is see which side has the nicest of the sheeting, if there are any little defects in the sheeting on one side or the other, and pick that to be the top side. Yeah, they both look pretty good. Usually sometimes you'll have a little dent or a ding or something you don't want to see in the final product. Well, this is a good way to eliminate it. In this case, it looks pretty symmetrical. Then I want to establish the exact center, which it's easy because I'm working off the drawing. I want to cut my little notches right in the back of the tail, right in the back of the stab. I want to recess this in because we're going to have take-apart hinges. This horn has to go so that the center of the 1/8 inch wire is right on the middle. And step one is because I know the center is exactly here. And I know I have a very thin trailing edge, so there's not going to be a lot to cut into. And I know I need to allow for the horn to rotate downward. Clean it out with some folded sandpaper. Now the next thing is I need to make the little impression of the 1/8 inch wire so that can sit down into the trailing edge. One of the ways you can ensure that you get a nice straight, you don't wind up with the horn cocked in one way or the other, or out this way. An easy way to do this is I lay this out with tape so that now I know where the center is, but I don't really want to know where the center is. I really want to know where this 1/8 inch gap is so I can run a little trough right in that gap, because that's where the horn is going to have to be recessed into. Now one way to do this is just an ordinary tip from a Dremel tool. And I can just lay that little trough in there. An impression is certainly good enough. Now I just need to cut two little slots that the horn retainers will go in. Two little slots cut. One of them goes into the rib, that's the center rib, so I want to make sure I get plenty of contact with that little retainer when I force it into that little spot. Once that's in, I need to mark this little area here because I need to push this in just a little bit more. See, it's sticking too far out. I need to get the center of the wire a little bit off of the hinge line. I don't want it sticking so far back, or else the pin for the hinges will be too far off. Just on this little piece here, I need to take out just a little bit more. So that sits back just a little bit more. Look at this, I can't even get my You can tell I have good eyes, right? So I'm being careful each step of the way here that I don't wind up putting the horn on an angle one way or another. Now with that recessed, I put one tiny drop of CA on both sides because I don't, just to hold this in temporarily, and I want to make sure I don't have any restriction anywhere here. And then I'm clear from the top down and straight in this dimension. Now I'm going to make myself two little horseshoe pieces of scrap balsa, like a retainer for the back here, because again this is only a 16th, so we need to make some kind of a little retainer for that. I can take a little piece of scrap, again just a Dremel tool bit, piece of 1/8" wire, something to make a little ditch in there. This doesn't have to be too fancy, because this is going to go on the other side to confine that horn. I can just cut off a couple little pieces of this. Almost looks like a little gear block. You just tack glue these blocks in, and each time I glue them in, I want to make sure, most important thing, I'm not getting any CA down into that joint between the little keeper and the control horn. If that gets frozen up, boy, you can just destroy a whole tail in one stroke of the pen. Have to get our little sanding block and even these, true them up. We don't need all this extra material. We're going to put a little bit of an angle on that. But the most important thing, don't get CA down in there. Oh. You'll do that once, believe me, and then you'll say, Wendy said that. And blame me. Because it only takes a few swipes and you can get that dress right off. And a couple of coats of thin CA just to harden it up. And of course make sure none of it is sneaking its way down in there. Ready to lay up the elevators. I thought I'd take a break from this. I'm doing the mail here before we start the elevators. This is from a friend of mine, Juan Luis Fernandez in Cuba. Now, he made a Spitfire from, I guess Model Aviation Plans. That would probably be the only other place you could get the plans from. But he wrote me a wonderful letter. How wonderful a plane flies, how much fun he's having down in Cuba. I'm telling you, send me a box of cigars. I don't smoke, but I know people that do. And he says he's an active modeler, has been flying F2B for about 50 years. 50, well, it's more than me. And he loved the Spitfire. He just could not believe how nice it flew. Hey, and he plans on entering F2B. I hope Castro or whoever, they let him go to the F2B, maybe even come up to the Nats. Hey, an unusual plane from an unusual... Not everybody has people building their designs in Cuba, so I don't know. I don't know that they... I'm very impressed, though. And I will return a few nice pictures to him. Juan Luis Fernandez. Look at the stamp. This is even cool. I mean, this is the kind of stuff... It blows me away that we have a worldwide network of people that are kind of friends. Look at this. He has good English, sir. Look at this. Boy, is he mistaken. But, see, this is part of model aviation. I don't even know how to describe it. That you wouldn't have this kind of relationship with people worldwide if you were, maybe into some other hobbies. Anyway, I appreciate it a lot. I'm sure he'll enjoy getting a couple of pictures of my Spitfires. I think it's neat that we have friends in Cuba. I don't know, and people from outside the area might not realize in the Bergen County area where we live, there's a giant Cuban, it's probably the biggest Cuban population in the world, and obviously it's nice to spread the word of stunt, coast to coast, border to border, ocean to ocean. Anyway, I looked in Pampa. He's not a member of Pampa either, so I'm going to send him a little copy of Pampa newsletter. See if Fidel lets him have it. We'll find out. Anyway, this is my last pieces of sea grain, the really nice sea grain that I'm using, the flat stuff. So what I'm trying to do is lay out just what amounts to be a skin. Notice that one of the things I'm doing is the grain is going a little bit different than what you might expect. When you make a piece, when you make an elevator or a flap, you'd really like to have, at all choices, the grain of the wood going parallel to the trailing edge, not the hinge line. When you do it to the hinge line is stationary, and so this tends to warp. If you have this is your primary grain going in this direction. I've always had better luck doing elevators, and I'd like to get virtually all sea grain in the elevators, but the grain going, notice how I'm cutting the hinge line into the front of the wood, not the back. And that's one of the ways of keeping. In fact, you can even mark if you want to, just make it easy when you cut up the pieces. Now I'll cut 4 of these pieces. By the way, just thinking of something, because this elevator is going to have a taper in it, because we're making a semi-scale plane, of course. If this were a cardinal, this would be a straight line. And of course, then you'd want to look at tape number 224, the Miss Ashley tape. By the way, there's a lot of advantages to having this not tapered, and there's no advantage other than it looks pretty doing it this way. It looks more scale-like. So the first thing is to cut up 4 skins out of sea grain 16th. We learned that making a Miss Ashley tail, which if you're making a cardinal, it might be that you'd want to use the elevators from Miss Ashley that have no taper. The only reason I can see to put taper in them would be that, you want to make it look like either a Typhoon or a Spitfire or whatever. Anyway, but that's one of the compromises to making a semi-scale plane. Now, we're going to have to make a little bit of a jig or a fixture once we get these skins made, because if you build a tapered piece on a flat surface, you'll more than likely build in a warp. Now, there's a lot of ways to do it. I have a little way of my own that works when it works. Anyway, I need to cut 4 of these, and I want the grain all going to the trailing edge. That's job 1. As an example, this is the best piece of sea grain that we have, but look at it. We don't want to use that for an elevator skin. By the time you get this flat, you're building in a lot of stress in the wood, and the last thing you want to have is an elevator that looks like this trailing edge. So what I'm doing is going to a little bit heavier wood, but wood that most of all is perfectly straight and sea grain. For my elevators, very, very important. Same as with flaps. Now I've marked each one of the trailing edges just for my own reference before I start to set this up. I want to make mirror images out of all 4 of these parts as the first step. Makes common sense. I don't want one elevator to be bigger or thicker than the other one. I'd like exact mirror images. And check, of course, that I don't have a piece of wood that looks like a gummy worm. I'm going to put all my rib lines on here because I like to have the ribs line up, if at all possible. Any little variance that comes through the sheeting that way kind of matches. They're not mismatched by too much anyway. Again, I'm just picking it up off of that line. And this sets all my positions for the ribs, and I need to do this to both skins, 1 for each side. Now what we need to improvise now is a little way of holding the trailing edge up. If we build this flat, we're going to have 2 warped elevators. We need to get the trailing edge up exactly half of the amount so that the center line of this is 1/4 inch off. Now the first piece I need to cut this is a piece of 1/2 by 3/8. I've stripped this out of a piece of nice light 1/2 inch. Now on Miss Ashley we hollowed out this piece. On this piece I don't think it's going to pay to do it. For the simple reason is we're going to put a very radical angle back for the hinge line, a little bit different than normal. and I don't think it would really take that much out. Again, a nice piece of 1/2 by 3/8. Another thing too is when you look at these, you want to make sure they're perfectly straight. Eyeball them up on all angles. What I want to do, I need to raise the trailing edge up, and I can do that with pieces of 16th ball, so I can do it with really any little shim stock I have. This will help. Oh, I just busted this one. This just holds the trailing edge up off the table so that we're building the elevator in neutral, in level. If we try to build it off of the table with one side flat, I'm almost guaranteed we're going to have a problem here. Now I can check this. Actually, I have to drop the glue on this. Since I know the elevator is a 16th and I want to be a 1/4 inch up, I can make this exactly the dimension I want, and then I can check. This is going to just hold this in. I mean, we don't have to go within 1/1000th of an inch here, but we sure don't want to have the scenario that we're looking to absolutely avoid like the plague, is that we've built one side on a flat table. Now this just is a temporary jig of sorts, just to hold this piece up. And you notice the little angle in the front. If you didn't have that angle on, if you're gluing this right down to that, you've just got this edge on about a 15-degree angle that you'll never get right. Shouldn't say never, but this is certainly a whole lot better than that. Now what I do, just get a couple little pieces of tape holding this down. And we just want to temporarily tack glue. This is just going to be a temporary joint here. Just temporarily tack glue this in place. Now I've tried to just get one little tack on here. Again, always best on any joint like this to tack glue it first. I'll let the glue just dry by itself. Then I want to take it off the paper and make sure I have the right angle. Now with that tack glued in place, now I can take the tape off. I'll take it off because this is Mylar paper, and I can run that whole glue seam. But I know I've got this angle up into the leading edge piece pretty accurate. And now I know I have that angle that I'm looking for, but I want to lock that angle in by just running a thin bead of CA on both sides. I guess that is about a 6 or a 7 degree angle, I'm not sure. But getting that angle right is the key to having this part come out straight. These ribs have a taper section, and then they kind of blend into a flat section for the last inch. But what that does is I don't really have to take a lot of material off. I'll block sand these when they're done, or else I could make each rib individually, but it's just a lot easier to make the last inch have a little bit less or almost no taper. So what I want to do is one by one. Now, I'll trim off the front of these because I want to get the back, and I'm just going to tack these in place. I want to make sure I have a 1/16 of an inch up here and the last little bit down here, maybe a 1/16 or an 1/8 of an inch, just a little bit of a gap, because otherwise these come to a point and that last little bit doesn't seem to really do anything. Now the next one I go to put in line, you can see what happened. Whoops, I got to trim a little bit off. So I kind of marry up the fact that I've got the last little bit. See how much I have to trim off. Just take that off. Now it's always best just to tack everything in place. A couple of drops, not permanent glue joints, because then you get to look at it from the back and see that you haven't somehow built a warp into it. It's just the slightest little bit of glue on there. And of course I'll just go right down now, laying the ribs in Each one, same operation, lay it 1/8 of an inch from the back, put it up on a leading edge. This part goes pretty quickly. As you probably can figure this out, you can make the elevator in about 10 minutes. Part of this that's really important now is when I'm gluing on the top skin, I want it to be in the jig. I don't want it to be off by even a little bit. So I'm going to lay on some alphatic. If you think the ribs are out of true, you could of course run a sanding block on this from looking down the edge. Another thing, by the way, you could do if you really want it to be fanatical, you can kind of look here and go down a rib. But these are relatively straight, and I guess I'm just lucky for that. The trick is get this at the alphatic's drying, and I'm going to go have lunch. So this will dry while I like the alphatic because it gives you a little time to work. Anytime you try to CA this and it's crooked, you build a big pretzel in there. So you can always schedule some other thing or whatever. But if you go through every step and check that it's straight, just sight it from the back, sight off the table, whatever method you like. And I could feel if one of the ribs were low. And one of the things I can do while this is drying that'll hold that in place while it's drying. While it's drying, I just want to make sure this is level, straight. Just the slightest bit of weight will hold that down while the alphatic's drying. We'll come back to this after lunch. The alphatic dries, and you know you've created a nice straight piece. So I'm going to screw up the trailing edge. Just sight down that trailing edge and make sure it's perfectly straight. Now I have this tacked in place. Just letting the tack dry up. That's what I want to do is I want to sight. It's just a piece of 1/8 inch for the trailing edge. Once I get that tacked in, and I know it's straight, I can run a glue seam on both sides. Then I can trim off all the extra. Again, at each step, sighting that I don't have, a twist in it. The next step, I want to just get the rest of this off with a knife, and I can go over to the sanding bench before we make up the tips and the hinges, and I can get a couple of sanding blocks going here. I always like to take as much off with a knife as I can. It's nice and straight too. Because again, we really try like crazy to keep the dust down in the house with the vacuum machine and with just not sand. Anything that I can carve, I like to carve instead of sand. before I carve that leading edge in, I want to make sure I have all these angles just about as accurate as can be. Again, a big reason this works so well, grain is going to the trailing edge, and it's all C grain. If you use A grain, it'll be less good. It's really worth scrounging around or ordering extra wood or whatever you have to do to get the C grain. Is I like to radius that edge. I don't want to do that casually. I want to get it to go, if we can, because the wood is soft, to radius that real nice. Because that's the edge that we're going to work on a trailing edge. We're going to work off of that edge. Okay, we have both elevators made, both elevators sanded. Now, it's real important at this point, before I make tips and hinges and hinge lines, I want to make sure of two things. Number one, that they're complete mirror images, and I keep using that. I've had many planes that I've seen guys build Banshees and things where one elevator is 1/8 of an inch longer or thicker or whatever, and the plane will always have a little twitch to it. Getting that so that you don't have, when the elevators present themselves to air, one doesn't present first before the other. And we spend all this time making them lined up and making them symmetrical. So they look like they're pretty good mirror images for now anyway. The other thing, and it sounds insignificant, but it can happen. You know, wood is not done in a machine shop. I want to make sure one elevator isn't thicker than the other. That looks well within range, and that they're the same thickness at the tip. And if they're not, what always happens is, yeah, that's good. What happens is one elevator will be behind the stab and the next one opens up, hits the air, and you have a twitch in a plane where it's not, well, it's an unnecessary thing. Getting the elevators and flaps to be symmetrical, equal, and mirror images, that would certainly be step one. Want to establish some center lines down the center, same as you do on a foam wing. 1/2 inch thick elevator. 1/4 inch is about the right amount to angle back. In other words, what we're going to do is put that angle in. We're going to put it in with tape first. The first piece of tape just sets the second piece of tape. This is just to give you a reference for the second piece of tape. Now that's the amount we want to take off. And I've found the tape being an excellent way to do it because it gives you a guideline, and you actually can feel it with the sanding block or the knife when you're coming up to it. Gives you a little bit of warning. Now let me just get this off. On an 1/8 inch flap, this is about the right amount. 1/8 of an inch would be the amount I would choose. But of course you could vary this a little bit further back. Will give you more angle or less. I think 45 is about all you need. That sets that angle. Now because we already have a center line, if you're not a good carver, what's a good idea is put a piece of tape, I'm not going to use this, but just as an example, this would give you an edge, and you could carve between those two edges with a knife. I don't know why I've never found that necessary, but I know some people have. You can really probably, if you're in the mood to save about 1/4 of a penny, you can use the same piece of tape over and over because it's just setting where you are. Anyway, using these little guides, this makes it that takes a lot of the eye work, eye-hand skills out. It gives you a nice reference line. I find is good. The brand new XL number 26 blade is held on about a 45-degree angle. Now if I can get this, I try to get it in not in one cut. If you try to do it in one cut, you might have a little more trouble. But if you can take it off
And I'm working my way up to about a 32nd of an inch from the tape. Always good if you don't hold the knife this way, if you hold it on a little bit of an angle, and on about a 45-degree angle, it'll be just ideal. Now, as I see, I'm getting close up. I'm getting close to the line. I'm getting close to here. Now I can transition into sanding block. Well, once you have that much done, it's easy to just transition into a sanding block. Get the last little bit, sand it off. And you can even hear it. And if you needed this, now, I just kind of work my way up into it. You can feel, if you can see right up here, it's not all the way in. Now, of course, I just reverse this and do the same thing on the other side, and I'll have this done. When I get to the fine sanding, of course, I always like to get over the sanding table. I can see that I have the edge. A decent sized sanding block will just give you a little bit of an advantage. You actually can hear when you come up and hit the tape. You want to go right to the point where you start to take the line off. Now when I'm coming up on the second side, I sure don't want to take the last of the line away. I want to get right up to the line and, if possible, not go through it. And it's just starting to disappear. You see it was a little high on that side. I like to just work right up to that. Okay, and I made up a little piece, two pieces actually, of aluminum tube with a little bit of a recess on them. These are going to get put over here. And now I need to just set the flap. I'm going to tack glue that in place. Get it on center here, get it exactly on center. And just tack glue it in place. This way, if there's any little angle, you want to set this right off the leg of the horn that it's going to be on. Way to get your elevators to line up perfectly right off the bat is just use a flat surface, since we don't have to be in dead neutral here. That lines up both tubes in both elevators at exactly the same time. And that's one of the ways you can just save yourself a lot of tweaking and fussing and everything, because now the tubes are in on the right angle. If they're a little bit off, each one is an individual match, so it doesn't matter. They just slide right in. And you have the hinge line tight as can be. That's the best trick for lining things up now. Each one is tacked in position. We know we have these tubes in real good alignment, and we know they're in alignment this way. So the next thing I want to do is from this point to this point, I want to get some 1/8" C grain if I can find it, and I want it end grain, top and bottom. This is a lot better of a way I've found than the typical way of making this rib out of plywood. Just adds a lot of weight, and it isn't any stronger because this is the weak point. Getting some end grain bolts on both sides seems to be the best way I know of to do this. It's just the fact that it's end grain that's important here. Now I'll get the other side on and then trim these off. These double pieces that confine this make it nice and solid, and yet it's easy to blend in. Okay, now this grain can go front to back. Now I want to trim this all off and get it nice and even, and I'll put another piece right on the end, and that gives me the effect that this is buried in end grain. Now I can rough out some of this, and some I can take off with sanding block. that much. Now, next thing is I want to get a piece, an end cap piece, right on the edge of this. And that'll take up the extra little space. I'll just press that right into the soft wood, so it'll be a real good confinement. Now, if you press down on this, you can get a nice flat edge, which saves a lot of sanding later. Okay, that should have kicked. Now, of course, the last thing is to sand this all in nice and smooth and cut that little notch. Very important, because the horn wire needs to go in. You can't have that all the way up to the front. And this, if you ever break the horn out of it, I don't think so. And years ago, when we made these pieces out of plywood, what a nightmare trying to blend the plywood into the ball. So this blends in beautifully. We'll hit it with some thin CA. That'll be just about as bulletproof as the 1/8" horns. And once that's all sanded relatively smooth, I want to harden up the wood. Just let some thin CA soak in there. And give that a light sanding too. Now, after that CA is hardened up and sanded, the last thing I want to put an edge of 64th plywood with the grain going in this direction, and that'll just act as a little protector and give us a place to mount our ball link for the Ray Brother. Now, by using a flat edge, of course, one of the things I get, at least relatively speaking, is a nice straight edge when this kicks off. And of course, the next step is just to scissor this off and dress that back off with the sanding block. It'll give us a nice edge to work with. And after that piece is sanded in nicely, and you know you have it tapered, I'll add another thin coat of CA, and this will harden up the wood, harden up the edge, spread the load out, spread the footprint of the torque from the horn out. Now, when I made Miss Ashley, I did not allow for a Ray Brother, because one of the things I wanted to do was have these real tight elevated fuselage fits. And I don't know if it really was not a good thing or a good thing, or if it was a draw. But I know that planes using big propellers, the bigger the prop, the more you can benefit from having a Ray Brother linkage. And there's several ways to do it. This is the part that goes on the inner elevator. And I've come up with this as my numbers. There's other numbers, and everybody would have their own private thing, but I try to get the little 256 ball link as close to the horn tube as possible, and 3/8 of an inch back. Now, what that allows me to do, that gives me enough adjustment that I make the horn, well, maybe 3/4 of an inch, but I put several adjustments in it. This always has been a good compromise. I've always been able to get it adjusted in 1 or 2 flights with that setup. And the little ball link snaps on, goes off, and if you decide you don't want to use it, you can unscrew the ball link, take the linkage, and just make a permanent rudder out of it. But this is one of the things on a plane. We anticipate using a 91, a 72, and a 70. There's going to be some big propellers on this plane, and this will be, I hope, one of the good trim features. Here, one of my favorite jobs, and I mean, every year I do this. I have to look through this whole box to find a ball link. They almost always wind up at the bottom. It's unbelievable. It wasn't even at the bottom, but this is what the little 256 ball links look like, and of course they have a part that goes on here. Now, what I do, rather than thread this, I have the 64th plywood, just using an ordinary straight pin, press in a little hole, hit it with thin CA, and thread this right into the 64th plywood. That's always been pretty strong, and the CA makes it fuel proof. You can see that gets it as close to the horn as possible. This is just about the right diameter. I can work it out a little bit. I want to hit that with some thin CA first, and then thread that ball link right in. We like to let that harden up in there. And you can see where exactly that winds up. One more drop of CA on that, and that's done. A couple extra coats of thin CA on there, and that's ready to go. Before I lay out the hinge pockets, I want to make sure I have that alignment as good as I can get it. Because if it's wrong, I still have the choice if I can take the elevators off and tweak the horn, 2 pairs of ice grips. What to do next is line up and see where I'm going to have to put my hinge pocket slots. I have that little tool that'll put a half a hinge pocket slot in there. I just need to mark with a pen where those parts, where those hinges will actually go in. Pull it off. I have that little tool that I've already made for this. I have two tools, one for taking the ordinary hinge pockets and one for doing shallow pockets. Usually those are what we'll use for take-apart construction. Pretty self-explanatory how to make up a tool, and the depth would depend on the barrel of the hinge. Now we'll see if we have enough clearance with the shallow pockets. If not, we'll open it up. You can see what that's doing. It puts a real nice slot in. So you can just run a knife in there for this hinge. This is a solid piece of wood. Get the center line back in there. All this requires here, I don't even want to make this any thicker. Just run a little 26 blade down in there a few times. All the hinges installed here. You can see what I've done. I've marked, because I need to recess half of the hinge into the trailing edge. It isn't like a normal hinge setup, because we're going to have that wire running here. That means we want to pull the hinge out into the middle so it's easy to thread that wire through. So I just transpose wherever that hinge pocket is, mark it, and use the shallow hinge pocket tool to cut the shallow hinge pocket. And we know, because this is the thickness of the Miss Ashley hinge line, we know that's going to work out pretty much like the Miss Ashley did. Okay, there's the final pocket. And now when we're actually installing the hinges, we need to have the wire in place. And that sets how much of the hinge goes in each side of the pocket, but it needs to be a half a pocket on each side to really work the way we want it to. Next session, we're about done for the day. In the next session, we're going to get the wingtips shaped, and then do a final sanding, and also be ready to do the final little details. What I did just before going to bed, I came down here and cut out the blocks that we're going to need. So I'll be ready to go tomorrow morning on the carving. The front blocks are 2 pieces of 3/8. So I'm going to be able to hollow them out once they're carved. The ones in the back, probably I won't bother hollowing out. They're not thick enough at the end. Anyway, we'll come down and work on it tomorrow. Another little job out of the way. Looking forward to seeing this thing in one piece soon. Morning, I'm going to try to rough these blocks out. Notice that I'm using the joint where I laminated the two together. This is just the the ones on the stab, use that kind of as a center line. Everything is tacked together because I'm going to pop these and hollow them out. If you have some real ultra-light 3-pound wood, maybe you could get away without hollowing them, but in this case, what we're trying to do is really come up with the lightest possible tail. Now, I'm running a risk here because these are just tacked very gently, and I don't want to break this off, so I'm trying to hold it whenever possible by the block itself. And the one thing I don't want to do, because the blocks are oversized here, of course, one thing I don't want to do is just break the thing right off, which probably is going to happen. Now when I get up to the front here, this is where it gets to be difficult. I want to go with the grain. See, carving against the grain, you just chew the wood up. Again, still trying to hold the angle, the knife at about a 45-degree angle. We know this is going to have a kind of a complex taper in it, because while the leading edge is radiused, I don't want this to be. I want this to taper into a nice smooth transition, so that's going to take a little bit of extra carving, a little bit of extra work. A lot of times, because the grain is going this way, I don't want the knife to go this way. I'd like to have it, if possible. See, I can just take ice shavings off of this. This takes a little bit of patience because I'm trying to bring that cut down. When you get into that end grain, it doesn't want to cut nice and smooth. And the last little bit, of course, will do with a sanding block. I don't want to risk going too far here, getting too cute. It's the same thing. I'm just trying to get that taper to go smooth, and then the transition from this radius to more of a point. Finally get to the point with this where I'm ready to start block sanding it in. But the hardest thing is to capture this angle, this radius here, and then as it gets to the end to taper it. So I'm constantly looking at the center line. I don't want it to taper in too quickly. I want it to be a very gradual transition. It's just a little more difficult doing this than a typical, where if we were keeping the half-inch radius for the whole edge, it would be a whole different ball game. But that last little bit I really need to do with a sanding block. And then what I need to do is this flat area to continue this flat. And I need to leave just a little bit extra material on here, just the slightest little bit. See, I could really put tape around here, but then I wouldn't get the edges right. I'm just being real careful to leave just a little bit of extra material, because then after this is hollowed out and I attach it, I want to get that final transition down. This is where it gets difficult now, because I still have a little more material. I want to have this taper. I'm referencing off the glue seam, but this side is a much wider, thicker. So coming down into that, and this of course will be one of the focal points of the plane. I don't want to just cheat myself on this. Okay, the next step is I want to split these apart. They're tack glued together. I need to clean off the edge. It always pulls a little bit of wood off. Then I want to hollow as much of this out as practical, but I want to also, see, I have the taper in here now. I have this angle, and it kind of evenly goes to a wider spread. Like opening up clams. I feel like I'm working in a clam house or something here. The next thing is I need to get some reference lines. I have two choices here. I can hollow this out right to the back and then put a piece of wood with the grain going in this direction, which is a nice way to do it, or I can leave 1/8 of an inch. I'm going to hollow this right to the very end, and that gives me a piece with it. I don't like to have the end grain out on the wingtip here. I like to have the grain so that the hinge, when you put the hinges in the end grain, it tends to be a little bit of a little sloppy. I can just estimate a little bit more than 1/8, because when I'm finished I want to do a little more blending. And I can just take whatever's in here. And out here I can go right to the very end. It's a little easier to hollow the part too when you can go right to the end. And the easiest way I know, and I try to always keep the dust down, is to get as much of this out. This is why I like to put the piece in the end here, because I can go right to the end and I can get even just a little more wood out. Anyway, the point is I want to get down to that last little piece of wood. That last little bit, it's just easier for me to get out with a piece of sandpaper. And so what I have is what amounts to be just nothing but a clamshell here, about 1/8 of an inch of thickness. And this is where sticky back paper usually comes in kind of handy, because it'll let you get right down to where you can remove the line. You can hold this up to a light bulb to see if it's getting too thin in some spots. In this case, I just go right up to the line, sand out the line, and I know I still have 1/8 of an inch to work with at the tip, which should be plenty. Once that line disappears, and you're done. A little piece in the back, and this gives me a fact that the grain is going in the right direction here. That's the advantage of doing it that way. Now I can tack glue this back in place and do a final sand out on it. Seeing what it is, this piece sets up all the edges and angles for the elevators. So I've seen so many people that they build an elevator and before they put the horn in, and then you go to line up the tips and nothing lines up. Always good to finish the stab in total before you do the last little bit on the elevators, and then you just, even if this is out a 1/64 of an inch, there's no reason, it should work out perfectly for you. And these have almost no weight at all now. Glue this back on permanently. This side I like to get off all little, press off the edges. And so that was a pretty nice way of making the tips. And you think every time you save, now this is probably saving 1 gram, 2 grams, whatever. Maybe 5 if you have heavy wood. But you're saving it at the tail of the plane. When you save it at the tail of the plane, you're saving it at the nose too, because this is this much less weight on both ends of the seesaw that you need to balance with. So having the extremities of a plane light is always a nice advantage. Most significant thing when I've tack glued, not tack glued, this is permanently glued, is I want to get this edge straight. I don't want to have an angle out there, so I'm real careful with the big block that I get this edge first. This is why I like to leave it a little bit oversized. Once I have that edge that I'm happy with, then I can sand all these other contours in for the final sanding and take maybe another 1/64 of an inch of material, so I continue that taper all the way out. The part that really takes a lot of time is as I've been block sanding this in, I'm trying to get both of them even, of course, but it's that, I don't like the look of just a flat tail. It looks like a piece of bread. I like it to get maybe out to this hinge and then start to really do a very gradual taper, so it looks almost like an elliptical wing. It'll just look a little more scale-like, but I've left enough material on the back end that I can really start to work that curve in now. Another trick too is once I get this curve exactly the way I want it, the next thing I'm going to do is thin CA the edge right up to here, because this will tend to take a beating from me, really. But this, I'm thinking I can take about a 1/64 of an inch off, so this has a little more of an elliptical look, more scale-like look, if that's the case. Anyway, once you get down to this final sanding, now there's another trick I use. I start squeezing it, and as soon as I feel it getting soft, if I get to that point, I'll harden this with thin CA as soon as it gets soft. Right now it's still pretty rigid. And what helps is having this leading edge, a laminate,
if we get it too thin, we'll start to see the glue joint come through from where the two parts are joined. Get to the point where I have this shape pretty much the way I want. This is the best little trick in the world, because all of the edges on the plane, they're always vulnerable. And no matter how careful you are, it always seems like it's the edges that take a beating. And what we're looking for is unlimited life here. We want, especially on a take-apart plane, I want to be able to try like making a new fuselage some year, or making a wider body, or I don't want to have to make this tail over and over and over again every year. I'm looking for some kind of infinite life. And once that kicks, and no kicker of course, then I can just even do a little more tapering, a little more tapering on that. It's difficult to get a nice blend between end grain, which is it's hard relative to this piece. So what you're trying to do is blend a hard piece and a soft piece. It's a problem. By hitting it with the thin CA, it's all the same relative hardness, and then you can get a nice, you even notice it right away. As soon as you start sanding the parts that have been hardened, you notice how the blend is just about perfect. Little details here, little details there, little weight savings, it all adds up. Now you almost can't feel where the joint is when you're done. The last step is going to be, and I push the hinges right in, so this will be a good alignment. I cut these blocks oversized, and no point putting this on video, it's going to be exactly redundant to the front piece. And then the last step, and the most important step, is we're going to come back to this and then do the final trimming of the part, so that they all match, because it's just one of the things I really like is when you can just run your hand around there and it just feels flawless. You can just run your hand here and you don't even feel any change. You almost can't feel the hinge line. That's one of the things I think is really a significant thing. When somebody is appearance judging a plane, they usually do it with their hands in there. Now if they feel something crazy, something that all of a sudden, well, I think that's something that's worth working toward. Even on these older planes that we did years ago, that's one of the things we always did, is try to get a really nice blend around the tips. I like to keep these pieces oversized to the last one. Imagine if you got to this point and you had this piece like that. Now what do? One thing I've learned really the hard way is to leave these parts oversized. In fact, we'll leave them oversized by even more than that. Try to get the hinge line. Now that we have a final. And basically just going to repeat all the same things we did. No point putting that on a tape. Blend this in, and the last step is going to be to put everything together and make sure everything matches perfectly before we put any dope on this. You just want to work off a center line. All I have to do is fit the two hinges into the tip. I always lay a couple of towels down for the final sanding, and this is the key thing, is once that hinge is in, and then this can't move up and down, then I can get this whole edge CA'd, final sanded, and usually, let's see if you can see this, usually this will be a little bit higher. I can just blend this right in with a sanding block as the final step. I think that looks pretty, well, as close to being what's a practical rendition of a Typhoon tail. Looks like we've almost got the aspect ratio right too. I'll find out in the final rendition here. Let me get those hinge pockets in. This just about wraps this tail up. This hinge pocket is in. What I want to do is sight from every possible angle and see that I have the same amount of stab showing over the elevators on both sides. If not, I can adjust the hinge pocket. Now that I have this, now I'm ready, and this will be time consuming. I'm going to give this about 1,000 strokes of sandpaper to make sure that there's no steps in it. Another thing too you can do if you really think you've got a problem is lay a ruler on and see that you have the same amount of light showing at every station. You don't want to have the elevator on an angle up or down. And it's this final sanding, when the whole part is together, I can sand the whole part together. It's really going to make a difference. whole pieces together. I have it on a towel, I can lay it flat. When I go to do the part with the horn, I can hang half of it off the table. So I can do both sides. Now the last thing, and it's one of the things that I like to use my hand even, just in case there is a high spot that I've missed. Because you will see it in the final analysis. And because it's flat right up to about here, and then it starts this very gradual taper. Now if you followed along, a tail like this should be relatively easy to build. It should always come out straight. And if you've used good wood, it should come out relatively light. Now Miss Ashley's tail was a little bit smaller on the tips, but basically the areas were the same. And if you're doing a cardinal kit, this is the way I would suggest. Just copy this, get a set of Miss Ashley plans, and put your own tips on. Now I think Miss Ashley's tail was 52 or 53 grams. I want to see what this weighs. Well, with the horn, all the hinges, and all the sanding, we might get 1 more gram off. It looks like we're at about, well, a little lighter than Miss Ashley. I think part of it is having this wood here, I think, was a little bit better than the wood we've used in the past. This is, well, it's hard to say. You know, you could always add a little bit. You can always sand a couple of grams off. In fact, I'm going to sand this to get it down to 50. And then I feel like, well, I feel like that's a good weight. Before we end the video, I wanted to mention Paul Walker sent me a letter today that had on it something I think he wants to keep a secret, but, well, he shouldn't have told me. He's thinking of, at some future time, doing a Lancaster. Paul, if you even think about it, you're in big trouble, because I've already thought about it. Well, who knows? Pretty soon we'll probably have a bomber class at the Nats. I always believe in congratulating people that have one-upped me, and I've been one-upped enough in my life to know how hard it is to do that. It's not easy to one-up when somebody's as crazy as I am. Paul, we're still impressed with the B-17, and if you ever want to do carbon fiber bodies for a B-17, maybe we could make 2 of them. We could arrange it. Video on doing a Typhoon tail is over. We hope this is going to help the people building Cardinal kits and add to the people like Walt Brownell that are already building Typhoons, and Elliot Scott. We're already well on our way to having Typhoons. Join us at the Nats this year. And if you're doing a Cardinal kit, get a set of Miss Ashley plans and just add wing tips to it. Add tips to suit your taste. And it might not even matter, even if you're doing a Lancaster or you're doing some other awesome semi-scale project. I think this technology, this way of doing the molding edges, I think you can benefit from this. And one thing about it, if you use all light sea grain wood, you're going to have a tail that'll just be the best it possibly can be. Again, thanks for joining us. Hope you've enjoyed the video. Please share it. And tell Paul Walker, let's do Wellingtons. Let's do Lancasters. Let's do something. The kind of luck we've been having this year. I just looked outside thinking, I'll go outside and get a coat of clear dope on this. And it's snowing like crazy again. So we're basically going to put this on a back shelf for a few days till we get some better weather. Again, it's just some days, you know, you're just fighting yourself when you get this kind of weather. It's been this kind of winter. You're in Typhoon land. I think of the Typhoon as just a continuation of what started with the Miss Ashley project and how many people we've been able to share this with. And I just think that it just couldn't get to be a lot more fun than it is. And I feel like even now I owe Gary Levitz a debt of gratitude for the inspiration and just inspiring me to build and put the time and energy into the Miss Ashley project.